I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. On this episode, dealing with denialism. There are articles condemning those who do it, and there was even proposed federal legislation to make it illegal. Yet, residential school denialism is alive and well in Canada. And the people at the heart of it criticize talk of reconciliation, scoff at those who say the residential school system was racist and genocidal, and call the discovery of unmarked graves a hoax. And now, some denialists who once hid on the internet are out in the open, speaking in public, and writing books. And through social media, they're gaining momentum. Survivors like Jennifer Wood say they've been dealing with a lifetime of denialism about what they experienced at residential schools as children. And Wood spoke about this with APTN host Dennis Ward on Face to Face.
I feel sad that she's taking that stance and using that kind of energy to deny such a fact of life that actually is the truth. Why doesn't she turn that energy around of what she's doing and come and learn and sit with us and talk to survivors and go to First Nations and learn how to say hello in our language and talk to some survivors that endured abuses? Why doesn't she put her energy into that? She'd be a much better person for it.
Today, a new generation of Indigenous youth are mobilizing to combat residential school denialism. Benjamin Kucher is one of them. The Métis Archaeology graduate student at the University of Alberta has spoken nationally on the harms of residential school denialism. And he, along with Métis activist Tracie Leost, co-wrote a letter to Prime Minister Mark Carney calling on the federal government to combat residential school denialism. The two youth have outlined their demands through 5 calls to action, including amending the criminal code to recognize denialism as an act of hate speech and funding community-led initiatives to counter it. Benjamin joins me now to talk about those demands and why institutions must take action. Thanks so much for joining us, Benjamin.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with the letter that you sent Prime Minister Mark Carney, which outlines 5 calls to action. And so the first one talks about implementing obligations 35 to 37 of the Office of the Independent Special Interlocutor's final report. Can you talk a bit about what these obligations are and why they're important to combating residential school denialism?
Yeah, so Obligation 35 calls on the federal government to combat Indian residential school denialism. 36 calls for provisions within Bill C-63, which is the act to enact the Online Harms Act, to specifically address harms caused by denialism about residential schools, including the missing and disappeared children and unmarked burials. Obligation 37 calls for the amendments to the criminal code, making it an offense to willfully promote hatred against Indigenous peoples by condoning, denying, downplaying, or justifying the residential school system, or by misrepresenting facts related to it. This denialism is profoundly harmful and re-traumatizes survivors who have courageously shared their truths, and it undermines intergenerational survivors who are working tirelessly for healing and towards damages for the national journey of reconciliation.
Thanks for that. And, kind of going back a bit, I'm also wondering what prompted you, as well as Tracie, to send this letter on September 30th, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation.
Yeah, so me and Tracie had the idea to send this letter on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation because denialism is not just this abstract debate. It's an urgent and growing harm, and it's something that myself, as well as Tracie and others doing the work of locating unmarked graves, have faced over the past few years. And the special interlocutor released her report in October of last year, and there has been no action on it. And so, as close to the anniversary of the government receiving that report, we wanted to make sure that this call doesn't go ignored and that the federal government has an ethical and moral obligation to address this issue.
Mm-hmm. And I was curious, you've worked a lot as a student activist, speaking on a national level against residential school denialism. Can you talk a bit about that work and, what you've learned from that?
Yeah, so what I've learned from doing this type of work and speaking out against denialism is that there are a large portion of the population that doesn't fully understand the extent of the harm of the residential schools. In facing denialism, as an Indigenous person, I've faced racist remarks, threats, and overall just trying to silence my voice. And so I felt with my identity and my responsibility to my communities and survivors that it's time to confront the ongoing harms of colonialism, denialism, and this ongoing erasure. The biggest thing that I've taken away in engaging with combating denialism is that a lot of denialists want clickbait. They want you to provoke a reaction so they can perpetuate a narrative that we are being aggressive and trying to ruin the reputation of Canada by bringing this topic forward.
And so you're also a graduate student in archaeology, and you're also the chair of the Canadian Archaeologists Association's Indigenous Issues Committee. And I'm kind of wondering, how do you see your work as an archaeologist and as a student, connecting with truth and reconciliation? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so for me as an archaeologist, archaeology has the tools to help communities identify and locate these unmarked graves. And using this knowledge and skills that I have in ground penetrating radar and other archaeological methods is one way that academia can be used to help advance social causes and uncovering the truth about residential schools. Through my role with the Canadian Archaeological Association, our committee is designed to help archaeologists who are Indigenous or non-Indigenous identify what the best practices are. And really, that role is to be a facilitator for conversations and figuring out how to move forward. And I think that's part of how the Special Interlocutors Report comes back into this is it outlines what steps need to be taken. And now it's about turning what we've learned into action.
And ahead of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we saw an uptick in residential school denialism. With people speaking on campus about these things. What message do you think it sends when institutions allow people to publicly push residential school denialism?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, it's to identify that denialism, its very goal is to undermine people's confidence in the work that is being done around unmarked graves. When it comes to academic institutions providing a platform, what I can say to that is universities are a space for academic debate. Not everyone is going to agree on various topics, but when it comes to residential schools and marking the 10-year anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, these are not facts that are up for debate. We have learned the truth from survivors, from the archives going through the documents. And so I think there needs to be a critical examination of what is academic freedom, freedom of speech versus hate speech and hate crimes.
So I want to go back to the letter, and two of your calls to action are focusing on legal reparations, amending Bill 63, as well as amending the criminal code to recognize denialism as an act of hate speech. I'm wondering if you can talk about the importance of legal changes to counter residential school denialism.
Yeah, so when it comes to legal changes to counter denialism, the reason we're pushing for this is we've seen a lot of talk from the federal government and different organizations about standing with survivors, but very little action has been taken. By implementing these legal changes, we are putting in a framework saying that, yes, we acknowledge what has happened and there need to be reforms so that the continued trauma that Indigenous people face across the country aren't repeated.
And another call to action, is asking the federal government to provide funding for community initiatives to counter denialism. And I'm wondering, what do you think some of these initiatives might look like in practice?
In practice, and the whole reason behind this call to action is that education, in the words of Murray Sinclair, is what got us into this mess, and education is what is going to get us out. a lot of people don't fully understand the extent of harm that residential schools perpetuated, both when they were in operation and now years later through intergenerational trauma. When it comes to specific action items, I think of the National Advisory Committee on Unmarked Graves, which operated for 2 years trying to help communities navigate the process of doing these searches. And earlier this year, the federal government decided to stop providing funding to that committee, and it can no longer do the work that it needs to do. So, by providing these funding and resources, the government is going to stand behind communities to show them that this is something that matters and it's something that needs to be addressed. But when that funding gets pulled away, it tells us that reconciliation and finding out the truth of residential schools is not something that's important for the government.
Mm-hmm. And so it's now been 2 days since you sent that letter to Prime Minister Mark Carney's office. I'm wondering, have you heard a response yet?
We have not heard a response from the Prime Minister's office. When we sent the letter, it was also CC'd to Sean Fraser and the Governor General, as well as the Mandy Gull, Masti, and Rebecca, the ministers responsible for Crown Indigenous Relations and Indigenous Services Canada. And we've gotten their kind of out of office automatic reply that the email has been received, but no action has been taken on it.
Mm-hmm. Before I let you go, I just want to ask, what comes next in, working to combat residential school denialism and this rise in residential school denialism that we're seeing? As you as an activist, you as an archaeologist, how do you plan to keep fighting this?
I think for me, the way we keep fighting this is recognizing that with the denialists, we share a common audience, and that is the public. And so I have a responsibility to put out the facts and my opinions on the situation and leave it to the public to judge. But there is continued need to pressure the federal government, the provincial governments to address the concerns of Indigenous people when we are facing such acts of violence and harm. And until such action happens, I intend, along with Tracie and others, to keep pressuring for changes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, Benjamin. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Today's episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. If you're liking the show, please leave a review. And if you have any comments or ideas, email them to infocus@aptn.ca. For more APTN News podcasts, visit aptnnews.ca or find us on your favorite player. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Homeless people aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? And why are they here? Find out in Our Relatives, Life on the Streets, hosted by me, Kathleen Martins. Listen on your favorite podcast player.